And welcome all. It's an icy but inspiring morning this morning. We're looking forward so much to hearing from Kevin Sack. And before we get ready, want to introduce everyone, as you know, to our pastor, David Gray, who will start us with prayer.
Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you for this day with the spirit, the warmth of community gathered here on a chilly day in Bethesda. Wherever we find ourselves this day, the gifts of heart and mind and spirit connect us. We give you thanks for Kevin, for his work, for his writing, for his willingness to share his wisdom with us today. Bless him and bless each of us. Mold us more in your image. In Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, as we begin, it's without further ado, we have also the really the wonderful opportunity of having Louise Meyer with us, who connected us with Kevin Sack, and she'll give us a brief introduction of background for Kevin.
Great. Thanks, Carol.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody, and good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Kevin Sack is a veteran journalist who has written broadly about national affairs, including civil rights, race relations, public health, and social justice for more than 4 decades, and has shared in 3 Pulitzer Prizes. He spent 30 years on the staff at the New York Times, where he was a senior writer, and worked previously for the Los Angeles Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. His work has also been featured in the New York Times Magazine. Sack is the author of Mother Emanuel, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church, published in 2025. The book explores the 200-year history of Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, site of the 2015 massacre of 9 parishioners by a white supremacist. Since the book's release, Sack has spoken widely about Mother Emanuel at churches, universities, libraries, and community events across the country. He reflects on the history of the church, the South, the lives of the 9 members who were killed, and the powerful Christian witness of forgiveness shown by their families and the congregation. Mother Emanuel has received strong critical acclaim. The book was named a finalist for major literary awards and listed as a New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year. Many reviews highlight the book as an important contribution to conversations about race, faith, forgiveness, and reconciliation in America, and it has been recommended by faith leaders, historians, and reading groups across the country. A native of Jacksonville, Florida, Sack attended Duke University. He now lives in Charleston, South Carolina, with his wife, Dina Sack. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
And one little update. He has moved for the semester to Princeton, where he is teaching a course right now. And he might give us a little background, but most importantly, it's just such a pleasure to have you with us, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you, Louise. Thank you to both of you so much for setting this up. It's a real treat to be able to talk to you guys this morning. You know, as I've moved around the country talking about the book, I've reflected a lot on how a single moment can totally change your life, right? And needless to say, you know, for me, thank God, the moment that I used to kick off this book, the night of June 17th, 2015, didn't have the kind of effect on me, obviously, that it did on the victims and the survivors and their family members. But it nonetheless totally redirected my career. You know, something that happened far away involving people I didn't know and had never met. It totally moved my career in a different direction for a 10-year period. Led to my wife and I changing where we live. We now live in Charleston. We had been living in the Atlanta area. So, you know, kind of moving to look back on and think about the way that this moment changed our lives, in addition to the way that it shattered so many lives in Charleston. And I thought I'd start off by just telling you a little bit about my experience of that night. as a way to bring us into the moment and go from there. Like I said, we were living in the Atlanta suburbs. We were at home. I was watching CNN and reading the newspaper when the very first accounts came over about a shooting with mass casualties at a church in downtown Charleston. And I literally remember sort of looking up from my reading. It caught my attention and thinking to myself, well, that's kind of weird. I guess maybe there are some explanations. Maybe it was a domestic dispute gone bad. Maybe could even have been a robbery or something. Um, those of you active in church governance might think, maybe a couple of trustees got into a beef, right? I mean, these things happen. And by the time the report had ended, they had identified the address of the church as 110 Calhoun Street and correlated that with Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And as soon as I heard those words, African Methodist Episcopal Church, my heart just kind of sank. I think my every jaded journalistic instinct sort of kicked in and told me that this was going to wind up being the horrific hate crime that it did, in fact, wind up being. I think I felt that because over the course of, at that point, a rather long journalistic career, I had spent a lot of time in and around Black churches doing reporting, mostly in the South. And so I had a real appreciation, I think, for the depth of the desecration that had been committed at Emanuel. I had a feel for the import and the symbolic role played by the Black church over centuries of the African American freedom movement in this country. And so I was hit hard by it. For those who may not remember the details, what happened that night, what became clear as I continued to watch the reports come in on CNN, was that it was Bible study. It was Wednesday night. It was a sweltering June night in Charleston. Bible study actually started about an hour later than usual because it had been preceded by a quarterly business meeting that the AME Church requires that its congregations have with the presiding elder, who's sort of a bureaucratic middleman in the AME hierarchy. They had that meeting, and as a result, it had delayed the start of Bible study by over an hour. And because of that, a lot of people actually went home. Folks who normally would have attended decided they were hungry. It's a very elderly congregation. Folks live a distance from the church. Some of them wanted to make sure they got home before dark. So a lot of people left. This could have been a much more horrific tragedy than it actually wound up being. But at any rate, 15 minutes into Bible study, the unlocked door to the fellowship hall, which is in the basement of the church, opens, and in walks a 21-year-old white man, wearing, oddly enough, given the weather, a long sleeve t-shirt and a waist pack strapped around his waist. He's invited in by the pastor, offered a chair next to the pastor, asked if he's there for Bible study. He says that he is. He's handed a Bible and a study sheet, and he sits there silently for about 45 minutes while they finish studying the parable of the sower from Mark. When they close their eyes in benediction, only then does he unzip the waist pack, take out a Glock, and begin to fire. He starts with the pastor, Clemente Pinckney, 41 years old, who not only was the pastor of the most historic AME church in the South, the very first AME church in the South, but also a 4-term state senator, a remarkable political and church prodigy. Kills him instantly and then proceeds to walk around the room as little old church ladies are diving under tables and looking for some sort of protection. He proceeds to walk around shooting folks one after the next. He winds up killing 9 people, They range in age from 26 to 87. Each is shot at least 5 times. The eldest member, 87-year-old Susie Jackson, the matriarch of the largest extended family in the church, is shot 10 times. There are 3 survivors. We first learn of the shooter's intent as he's walking around. The youngest victim, 26-year-old Taiwanza Sanders, a recent college graduate, has already been shot, but he manages to sort of lift himself up on one elbow and beg this guy, please, please, you don't have to do this. We mean you no harm. And the shooter responds that, yes, he does have to do this. You're raping our women and taking over the world. So this is the first announcement of his white supremacist intentions. He's later arrested the next day after fleeing and making it as far as North Carolina. And in an extensive interview, confessional interview with the FBI, he openly acknowledges what he did and the purpose, which he says was to try to incite a race war, essentially, to incite to commit what he called the very caricature of a racist act, something so dastardly that it would inevitably generate some sort of response that would devolve into some sort of greater conflict. This is what he imagined. I knew almost nothing, well, I knew literally nothing about Mother Emanuel at that time. I'm embarrassed to say now I had never heard of the place. But in real time that night, I started Googling it and was just astonished by the skeletal snippets of history that popped up on my computer. As I said, this was the oldest AME church in the South, and not just once, but twice. It had been formed in 1817. Then the church was destroyed after it was associated with a plotted slave rebellion in Charleston. Some of you may have heard the name Denmark Vesey. Vesey was ostensibly a member of the church, and much of this rebellion plot was fomented out of the church. As a result, the church is destroyed after the plot is discovered, and 35 men are hung, half of them associated with the church in some way. Had an incredible Reconstruction era history. The church is reformed after Union troops march into Charleston in 1865. The church quickly is revived by AME missionaries who are sent down south to follow Union troops into the city. And the founding pastor, Richard Harvey Kane, goes on to become one of the 16 African-American Republicans elected to Congress during Reconstruction. The people who spoke from the pulpit over time are just remarkable. Booker T. Washington in 1909, W.B. Du Bois in 1921, Dr. King spoke there at a voting rights rally in 1962. His wife, Coretta, his widow, Coretta, spoke there in 1969 when she was leading a hospital workers' strike. So it was almost like you could follow the progress of Black intellectual thought and activism simply by sitting in the pews of the church over the years. It had a storied civil rights history, led by the longest serving pastor in the church's history, B.J. Glover, who was there from, I believe it was 1953 to 1965, and who was one of Charleston's leading civil rights activists, led demonstrations and marches from the church, held mass meetings in the church, all at some risk, obviously, to the congregation. And because of that, with some opposition from his congregation. So as I'm reading all of this, I'm thinking, my God, this, I'm so affected by what's going on here in real time, but I'm also just fascinated by everything that had brought this congregation to that moment. I mean, clearly that moment was going to be a real marker in the nation's racial, the arc of the nation's racial narrative. But so much had happened there before. And I started to feel a couple of things simultaneously. One, that um, the congregation shouldn't forever be known for what happened, only for what happened that night. The history was too rich to get lost in the horror of that one evening. And I also thought it was important that people understand why it mattered so much that the shootings happened there. This was not a randomly selected place. It was picked for its symbolic impact. And I thought people should understand what that impact was, the importance of a congregation like this. The other thing that started to occur to me was that um, you could use the story of this congregation to tell the broader story of African American life in Charleston over a long period of time. And I thought that had real value for a couple of reasons. One was it was Charleston. And I argue in the book that there may be no place in America whose history is more central to understanding our racial story in this country than Charleston. 46% of all all enslaved Africans who disembarked in North America did so in the port of Charleston, 46%. And of course, we all know the Civil War began at Fort Sumter. So it's an important place and a place that that requires some real understanding, some national understanding. The other thing that I thought was valuable was just the length of time that the place had been around, more 200 years at that point, more than that now. And I thought that so much of our history is centered on not just our African American history, but all of our history is centered on a single event, a single personality, maybe a movement, a year, a decade. This story, the story of this church, allowed me to tell this story of African American life in Charleston over a 2-century span, and to show the connectedness of events and people and the way that things lead from one to the next. And I thought that presented a real opportunity that you don't always get in writing a history like this. The other thing that was going on, obviously, as many of you will remember, that 2 days after the shootings, the shooter, Dylan Roof, is extradited back down to Charleston. And there's a bond hearing, a first appearance in state court. None of the family members of the victims are invited to attend, but no one is told in advance that they'll be afforded an opportunity to speak. No one expects to speak when they walk into that courtroom. But when the judge does ask if any family members want to talk and sort of calls out the names of the victims one by one, 5 family members parade to the microphone and one after the next offer this then as now, as far as we know, utterly remorseless white supremacist, mass murderer, some degree of Christian forgiveness. I was watching this live on TV. I'm sure many of you may have been as well, or at least remember this. I think it was the purest expression of Christianity that many of us have ever witnessed or experienced, right? And I was filled both with awe and befuddlement, I think, at the same time. I wanted to know where it had come from, how it had happened. And like many of you, I couldn't really imagine putting myself in their shoes and coming to the same place. They had done so almost instantaneously. So I started to think about this as I was reporting on the history of the church, and it started to occur to me that if there was an answer to that question of how these people had done that, I would find it by studying the history of this particular congregation and of the denomination. And what I found in the end was very interesting, and I sort of devote the epilogue of the book to this sort of a reflection on the role of forgiveness and grace in the Black church experience and in the African American experience more broadly. But I interviewed all of these folks, the 5 who spoke that day, and there actually was a 6th who preceded all of them, a young man named Chris Singleton, who was the son of one of the victims, Sharonda Singleton. He was, I believe, 19 at the time. Remarkable young man, minor league baseball player at the time. He was playing college baseball. And there was a memorial service on Thursday night, the night after the shootings, at the high school where his mother had taught and coached. He and his sister walk out of the service, and a British TV reporter thrusts a microphone at them and says, "What are you feeling right now?" And Chris, without blinking, says, there's only love from our family right now. We already forgive him for what he's done. So the next day, of course, there's the bond hearing. None of these folks have seen this interview. None of them know about what Chris has said, but it's almost like they're channeling him in the courtroom that day. After interviewing all of them, as well as any number of other congregants, ministers, AME officials, theologians, I concluded that the forgiveness that they expressed was really more for themselves than it was some sort of prayer for the soul of this unrepentant sinner. They told me to a one that their expressions of forgiveness were totally unpremeditated, unplanned, and almost inexplicable. They couldn't really tell you where it had come from. I mean, we all know, obviously, that forgiveness is a central tenet of Scripture. We can list off the verses, and we hear them Sunday after Sunday, Wednesday night after Wednesday night. So obviously, a lot of that is sort of ingrained in the practicing Christian. But in the Black church, I decided it took on extra meaning. And after listening to them talk about how, I mean, Chris Singleton, for instance, will say, I still don't know how the words came out of my mouth. They just did. And they all attribute it essentially to an act of God. This was a spiritual, mystical thing. It was God talking. They were merely the vessels. The other thing they emphasized, as I mentioned, was that they weren't thinking about him at this moment. This was an expression, an iteration of a mechanism that had been adopted and adapted by the Black church over the centuries, really as a means of survival. You listen to these folks and they will tell you, it's the only way I get through. It's the only way I get by. It's the only way I wake up each morning, years after my son or my mother or my sister was assassinated while praying in the church. It's the only way that I can get up and put one foot in front of the other. It's a release. It's a form of relief. And as I started to think about that and sort of extend that over the course of African American history, it occurred to me that, how else do you get through? When you start to pile up the list of offenses committed against African Americans in this country, starting with their bondage and enslavement and moving on through the discrimination of Jim Crow, the lack of voting rights, the lynchings, the arrests, the job discrimination. Needless to say, I could go on and on. How do you get through that day after day without being so consumed by the toxicity, right? How do you find a way to not respond with anger and frustration and even violence, right? How do you find a way to not respond in kind? Well, forgiveness winds up being the way. And in that form, it seemed to me that forgiveness really was almost a reclamation of agency. It was these folks saying, he's taken my loved one, he has destroyed my community, but it ends there. He is not going to take my ability to live out the rest of my life with some sense of joy and purpose and commitment. That's not going to happen. So this is our declaration. And in that declaration, I think, is a lot of resistance. You'll note that the word resistance is in the subtitle of the book, 2 Centuries of Race, Resistance, and Forgiveness in One Charleston Church. There's been a lot of resistance in the history of this church. And that's an important theme of this book, is to show that, in fact, African Americans did along every step of the way, resist the conditions imposed upon them. And so I think, just as Morris Brown, the lay preacher who led a remarkable walkout from white Methodist churches back in 1817, and in this sort of unthinkably subversive act, created this Black church in antebellum Charleston, just as he resisted, just as Denmark Vesey, the revolt leader that I mentioned before, resisted, just as Richard Harvey Kane, who went to Congress during Reconstruction, resisted, B.J. Glover, the civil rights pastor who led marches and demonstrations from the church, just as he resisted, that these folks, in their own quiet way, were resisting the conditions imposed on them. I think that's about it in terms of opening comments. The only thing I would add is that, I could not have predicted the political environment that this book would be born into when I started working on it literally a decade ago. No author can predict that. It's just a roll of the dice. But given the political environment that we're now in, this book is not political in any way. It's not intended to be partisan in any way. But I do hope that it will stand as something of an antidote to the real assault that we're seeing on actual American history, both at the federal level and at the level of many state governments, right? This is real history. This is the way it actually happened. And to deny it, to minimize it, diminish it, act as if it didn't take place is just, it's a real insult to the memory of the people who died in Emanuel's fellowship hall that night, as well as to the memory of all of those who preceded them. And my argument is that it's our shared history, and needs to be accepted as such if we're going to make any progress in this country. And I don't care when your people got here or who you are. I mean, my family came long after the Revolution and long after the Civil War. I accept both of those moments as vital parts of my American history, as I do with this. And I think that the faster that we abandon these notions that history can be or should be whitewashed and start to accept this as all of our histories, the better off we'll be. With that, I'm happy to take any of your questions.
I just, first of all, thank you. I read the book. I was amazed as I went through it. You were so diligent and professional in your research and in the documentation, but the book also opened up all kinds of, as a history person, I was amazed at what I didn't know. And the book is a real monument to the work and what we witness through you. Your intention to help us understand and provide real truth in a very difficult time period. But I would like to open this up to a number of questions as to where we're coming from. We've got folks on remotely. If you would like to raise a question through the chat, we welcome that, and we'll try to get to you as we can. So is there an opening question that we might entertain? Yes, Ben.
I was surprised to find out that the killer did not come from what I would think of as the typical background to create a racist of this sort.
Right.
And as a psychologist, I'm naturally interested in what helped create this kind of this kind of hatred. From what I recall, it sounded like he was a person a lost young man who found some sort of solace online and this grew from that. But can you say more about that?
That's exactly right. It's a very weird case. And I covered his trial, which started in December of 2016 and finished in January of 2017. And it was incredibly unsatisfying in providing an answer to that question. I mean, we all obviously were there to try to figure out what had driven him to this dark place. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but he made that line of discovery almost impossible by essentially commandeering his own defense during the trial. He was assigned very capable defense counsel, death penalty defense counsel. This was a federal trial. And he allowed them to represent him during the guilt or innocence phase of the trial, which frankly was a total slam dunk for the prosecution. I mean, he had confessed to the crime, among other things. But then he sidelined his defense team during the second part of the trial, the part where the jury determines the penalty, death or life in prison, specifically because he did not want the jury to misunderstand or the public to misunderstand his intent. And he knew that the only reasonable defense that his lawyers could put up was a psychiatric one, right? He did not want anyone to think that he had committed these crimes because he was crazy. He wanted everyone to know that he was a zealot, not a lunatic. And so he literally won the judge's agreement to sideline his attorneys. He represented himself during that second half of the trial, and as a result, no evidence was introduced as to his mental health. There had been competency hearings held behind closed doors before the trial began to determine whether or not he was competent to stand trial and competent to represent himself. The judge ultimately decided he was competent to do both. But there was a lot of expert evidence presented during those hearings, which was later unsealed after trial, and that I was able to study. Psychiatric reports for both the defense and the prosecution. And they painted a much deeper, much more nuanced picture than the jury ever saw of who this kid was, but nonetheless a very incomplete picture. And the story basically is that he grew up in a broken family. His parents had split actually before he was born. They briefly reunited, at which time the pregnancy occurs, and then split up again, I think maybe even before his birth, if not shortly after his birth. His childhood is spent sort of roaming around from household to household as His mother floats from boyfriend to boyfriend. And he is always sort of a withdrawn, introverted kid. He winds up dropping out of school in about the ninth grade and essentially holding himself up in his bedroom, interacting only with his computer. And it's there that he discovers white supremacy. He tells the FBI that it all began when he Googles black on white crime in the aftermath of the Trayvon Martin incident, and comes across these white supremacist websites with distorted data. And this starts in some way to make his rather disordered world make sense. One thing that was very interesting in the competency hearing materials was that he was diagnosed pretty conclusively as being autistic. And he had not been diagnosed in that way previously. So what does that tell us? Needless to say, there are all sorts of autistic people, even all sorts of autistic white supremacists who don't then take the next step, right? And buy a gun immediately when they turn 21, stake out a church half a dozen times over a 6-month period, and go to Bible study and start shooting. But what was interesting to me was the opinions of a couple of the psychologists that once he sort of went down this internet rabbit hole and discovered the appeal of white supremacy, whatever that was to him, he sort of fixated on it with an autistic focus. That made sense to me. That once he got there, once he went down the hole, his autism may have made it difficult to climb back out. In terms of his family life, yeah, you're right that it seems it's not what you would have predicted. His grandfather, his paternal grandfather, was a well-respected lawyer in the Columbia area. In fact, he was the president of the County Bar Association at one point. His father was a construction contractor. Do I think there was probably some low-level racism in the household, the kind that you might find in a lot of Southern households and frankly in a lot of Northern ones too? Yeah. Do I think the N-word was used from time to time? Yes. Do I think it was kind of the organizing principle in that household? No evidence of it at all. He seems to really have to gone this direction largely on his own. Hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you.
Han?
So just continuing on this, and I have another question. Do you see the radicalization of young men today? You're saying about, this person had autistic background, was sort of, lost young man or whatnot. But now it looks like a lot of young men, even highly educated, going to school, doing their PhDs or whatnot in prestigious university, are openly getting radicalized from the internet, from things like TikTok and all these influencers and all that stuff. Do you see a parallel in how he got radicalized and how young men nowadays are getting radicalized in college or whatnot? So that's my first question. My second question is, I was just wondering if you have any thoughts, or maybe you had interviewed the church members, because I think a week and a half after the shooting, there was the activist who climbed the Confederate pole and ripped off or I think removed the Confederate flag as a way of not just, you mentioned most church members did a silent sort of forgiveness kind of resistance, but I guess there was that activist who chose to be so out and publicly resisting by climbing up the pole and remove. So I don't know if the church member was kind of like a little awkward about it. It's like, oh, that's not one of us. I don't know if they have reacted at all to that event.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me take the first one first. And I'm sorry, refreshed my memory. The way you put the question was whether it was radical, whether you saw analogies with radicalizing other young men today, right? You know, I'm a little reluctant to draw too much of a comparison because to some extent, I think this case was highly individualized, and I'm not sure that uh, it's just hard for me to know how many of the folks that we see undergoing this kind of radicalization today were in the same place that he was. I mean, I do think he was very much a lost kid who was looking for some way to make his life meaningful, and for for whatever sick reason, this is what he came up with. I don't find that he was highly politicized. It almost was a different era. In fact, again, not to put too much of a political spin on this, but Donald Trump had taken his escalator ride down Trump Tower to announce his first candidacy the day before this happened. So I think and I think a lot of the radicalization we see today, I think is hard to separate from the MAGA movement and Trump. That was not at play in 2015. And then in terms of the flag coming down, you know, church members at this point were just in deep shock and deep mourning. And I think it was sort of beyond them to be talking and thinking about the political implications of all this. I think I think they fully, well, I don't know. I think there was probably plenty of support for her demonstration against the flag. There certainly was a lot of rejoicing when the flag ultimately came down. And you'll remember that was a direct result of all this. Dylan Roof, they found photographs on Roof's camera and in his computer of sort of pictures he had taken while touring Confederate sites and Civil War sites around the state, many of them posing with a Confederate flag. And indeed, he had pictures on his camera of the Confederate flag that was flying outside the State House in Columbia. And at this point, it just became impossible, really, for defenders of the flag to continue to argue that the flag was not a symbol of hate, and that it was not intended to be an insult or to be an insult to 25% of the state's population. And so the argument just sort of crumbled of its own weight. The other thing that happened, obviously, is that South Carolina has become home to a number of significant multinational corporations, BMW and Michelin, Boeing. And Nikki Haley, who was the governor at the time, started to hear immediately from those folks that this needs to end, this flag needs to come down. That may have provided some of the backbone that she needed to call for its removal after basically declaring that it had been a dead issue at the beginning of her term. The great misfortune, obviously, is that it took the deaths of 9 people, including a much beloved state senator, to get that flag down.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about the response of folks in Charleston to your book? And I was struck, but because you spoke to the Charleston Literary Society in November with Eddie Glaude, and I looked at the church, and the recording shows all these white people. And I went, oh my gosh, what's going on in Charleston?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, because you just have been living there, why do you feel the Charleston, but yet at the same time, here we are in the midst of this, what we've been dealing with the Trump, situation.
Yeah.
So, and I know Charleston's still pretty red. So, what has been the response and the effect of this incredible book to folks in Charleston?
You know what? I left the church that night, Carol, saying to myself and to my wife, I think that, never has there been so many white people in that building. Ever, not since 1891 when it was constructed, has it been packed with nothing but white people. Yeah, it was a sold out crowd. And as I told Carol and Louise the other night when we were prepping for this, it would have been easier to find Waldo than a person of color in the audience. So it was a very strange sensation to be there, in a black church talking about a book about black history to an almost exclusively white audience. And honestly, I've found that a lot. A lot of my audiences have been predominantly white. Not all of them, and it's depended on the setting and where it is. Um, and I've been struggling a little bit with how to feel about that. And I'm not quite sure that I've come up with a conclusion. Um, I don't think there's lack of interest in the book among
Yeah.
among black readers. But it's interesting. We had an event in Atlanta at the Atlanta History Center the week that the book was launched, and we had a great crowd. It was very diverse. And during the Q&A, a woman in the front row gets up and she sort of waves the book at me, and she thanks me for writing it. She says, "But this book is for white people." She says, "Yeah, we know this story. We may not know the details about Charleston and what happened in this year and that year, but this is our story and we know it. And it's you people that need to know it." And maybe that's part of what's going on. I don't know. I'm gratified that white readers are coming to the book. I mean, I think it's a book that all of us need to read. It's history that we need to know and that many of us don't know. And certainly the most gratifying notes and letters that I've gotten have been from white readers who said, "Geez, yeah, I've heard this vaguely, but I've never really felt it in the way that I do after reading this book. You've brought it home to me." That's obviously very gratifying. In terms of what's going on in Charleston, I'll talk a little bit more broadly than just about the response to the book. I'll talk about the response to the moment 10 years ago. It's been very interesting, I think. There's been a lot of what I would call significant symbolic change. And I don't think that symbolism and significance are necessarily mutually exclusive. So yeah, the flag came down in Columbia. That really mattered. Should never have been up in the first place. Been there since 1961, but at least this did bring it down. Similarly, there was a statue of John C. Calhoun, the great slavery defender from South Carolina, that towered over Marion Square for generations. Marion Square, the Central Plaza in downtown Charleston, on the 5th anniversary of the shootings, which happened to coincide with the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020. That statue was brought down by the city council and the mayor. The Mother Emanuel sits on Calhoun Street. The portion of the street that it is on has been renamed Mother Emanuel Memorial District Way. the city council a year or two after the shootings, in direct response to the shootings, passed a resolution apologizing for the city's role in the slave trade. Now, it wasn't a majority vote. I mean, it wasn't a unanimous vote. It was 5-2. So that tells you a little bit about, exactly where the city stands. Actually, I think I've got that wrong. I think it was 7-5, excuse me. So it didn't pass by much. The police department conducted a racial audit looking at its law enforcement practices and whether there was bias in hiring and arrests and sentencing, things like that. And maybe more importantly than any of that, I think it's just a softer, more self-reflective place about race than it was prior to 2015. Even though this kid wasn't from Charleston, he had driven down from the Columbia area. I think this moment really made the city reflect about its past and started a lot of conversations that didn't happen previously. You guys will be interested to know because you do very much the same thing. There was a book study group that formed in the immediate aftermath at Grace Episcopal Church, which is the Episcopal Cathedral downtown. It sits adjacent to an AME church, Mount Zion AME. And so the predominantly white congregation at the Episcopal Church and the black congregation at the AME Church started getting together on Tuesday nights to discuss books about race, led by a black pastor and a white vicar. My wife and I went a number of times back in 2019 when we had moved to Charleston temporarily to work on the book. And it was fascinating and rewarding. Really was a safe space for open conversation. And I think you see a lot more of that around town than you used to. And I feel that in the response to the book, which has been overwhelmingly positive. In fact, as far as I know, at least to my face, it's been universally positive. I think people have really appreciated the work that went into it and the statement that it makes in declaring in a place like Charleston that the city's African American history is just as important as its very storied and involved Revolutionary and Civil War history.
Other questions? Folks remotely, let me know. You wonder. I do know that there was some response from the African American community about, especially the African Methodist community, about the history of the church and how it kind of highlighted some differences. What have you heard from the AME community?
Yeah, nothing to my face.
Okay.
I'm sure plenty behind my back. But I think what Carol's referencing, for those of you who haven't looked at the book, is I spent a certain amount of space talking about the governance of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, which I found to be rather fascinating, and some of the problems that governance system has caused in the past and continues to cause. And people ask me about, what it was like, the difficulties of coming into a process like this as an outsider. Well, this is one area where I think it was a benefit because I was able to take a more anthropological approach, I think, to these kinds of issues, a more objective look than somebody on the inside might have been willing to do, or it might not even have occurred to somebody who had kind of lived within this system their whole lives, that there was anything to question about it. But the denomination is top heavy with all-powerful bishops who are elected at quadrennial conventions called general conferences. There are a couple of dozen of them, and they're assigned to geographic districts. So, for instance, there's one bishop who oversees all of South Carolina. And those bishops have the power to appoint pastors. Pastors are not called by their congregations, they're imposed upon their congregations. And as a result, a minister walks into his new church with almost no natural base of support. There's not necessarily any buy-in from the congregation. They've had nothing to do with the hiring of this person. And in an old, staid, traditional congregation like Emanuel, that's almost immediately a recipe for conflict. Who is this guy? Why does he think he knows how to do it better than we do? We've been doing it all these years. It must be right. And so there's almost always tension. In fact, the night of the shootings at the quarterly conference, the business meeting that I referenced, there's a portion of the conference that's reserved, that's opened up for general comments from the congregation to the presiding elder. And with Pastor Pinkney sitting by the elder, his boss, right next to him, a member of the congregation got up and read a screed, really, against the pastor and his absenteeism. He was a pastor who was torn between various responsibilities and driving all over the state, back and forth between his home near Columbia, the church in Charleston, his legislative district, which stretched 2 hours south of Charleston. And the fact of the matter was, he just wasn't around that much. He got there for Sunday services. You could schedule meetings with him, but he actually rarely made Bible study. He was there that night because of the business meeting and the presiding elder being there. And so, an hour before he's assassinated, and he's enduring this critique from an important member of the congregation in front of his boss. Pretty tough situation. The other thing that I spent a lot of time looking at was just the financial dealings of the denomination. There's kind of been scandal after scandal. There's almost an acceptance, I think, among the laymen and women of the denomination that this stuff goes on, and you never really know where the money's going or whose pocket it winds up in. I was invited to attend a South Carolina conference. And this was a smaller sort of district-wide meeting at which the bishop on the first day called for an offering from all those in attendance. All those in attendance are ministers and other leaders of congregations. And he called for a $20 offering. And they all literally walk up, sort of waving $20 bills in their hands and placing them in the bishop's open palm. The money then goes to a table and is counted and sorted, but it's just all, a little, how far do I want to go in describing it? Icky, maybe, just unregulated. And so I had the audacity to write about some of that.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I want to give you credit for that, because to me, there would have been some temptation in elevating the knowledge of what all the church has done, the AME Church has done, and the crucial role it's played in the development of racial relationships in this country, and its overall importance, to skim over some of the warts and problems. So I give you journalistic credit for going there.
Thanks. I mean, I appreciate that. And I think I felt that both in terms of my portrayal of the individuals involved and the portrayal of the church itself, that I had to be real. That the story only benefited from being three-dimensional and portraying these folks as actual human beings, and the church as a church, like churches we all know, that struggle with internal conflicts and sometimes lack of professionalism um, and confrontations among components of the membership. I thought it was important to not let this event lead to sort of a martyrdom, of both the folks and the institution.
We have, Bonnie has one comment and then we're going to have to close things off with Bonnie, what? Bonnie Holcomb? Oh, she has her hand up. Bonnie? Can you hear us, Bonnie? Oh, she had raised her hand.
Does anyone know Bonnie well enough to anticipate the question she was going to ask and ask it on her behalf?
Bonnie, we probably can't because she's such a deep thinker. So yeah, what is next with you, Kevin? We're interested in that. And I'll have one comment. Yeah, what are you looking at next? I know you're teaching.
My choice to teach this semester is very much designed to put off that decision, Carol. I'm deferring. No, it's I've been kicking around ideas for another book. I had spent really a couple of years towards the end of the Mother Emanuel process, working sort of casually on another idea that I've recently concluded just isn't going to work, isn't going to pan out, which is a little bit heartbreaking to devote that kind of time to something that's not going to produce a book. So I've laid it aside and I'm currently looking at another possible idea, also Charleston based, also race related, but it may or may not come to fruition. I've got to finish this term and get back home and start getting to work on it.
Well, Kevin, we can't thank you enough. This has just been amazing that you have spent your time in the present, in this moment, with us to share your experience. It's been so enlightening, and we still have so much to learn. I know with me, I am still really struggling with this forgiveness. What role does it play? What are the different dimensions of forgiveness? And given that we're witnessing a lot of oppression right now, directly with our own community, what role might forgiveness play?
Yeah.
And not to lighten this up at all, but next week, Denise Diab will be with us, our associate pastor, who will be talking about the book that we'll be using in small groups ahead of us. And that is Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, not in the light, but in the dark, which is a very rich and provocative book in its own way. So please join us next week. This session has been recorded. Feel free to refer other folks to it. And Kevin, we hope to stay in touch in one way or another.
I'd love to. Thanks to all of you. I appreciate your interest. Thank you.